Hello. The Divine Code reading for November 15th, pages 321 and 322. We are currently in the chapter, The Prohibition of Separating Meat from an Animal that is living or in the process of dying, and restrictions on consuming such meat after the animal's death. Topic number 12, and this is the last topic in this chapter. If a living animal is cut into two portions, now it's not 100% clear what that means by two portions, but in topic number 11 from yesterday, there's a mention if the body was cut in two halves, and we kind of assumed that meant it was cut maybe through the torso so that the hind legs and the front legs are separate. The body is cut in half in that manner, or some other similar manner. The teaching was that the animal cannot be consumed until the heart stops beating, even though it's already been cut in half and it's assumed to be almost dead. But you have to wait. The person has to wait until it's actually dead before cutting pieces off of it. But here it's saying that if it's cut in two portions, although it was previously explained that it is forbidden to cut off limbs or pieces of meat until the animal dies, the two sides are not considered Aver Memakai, and therefore may be eaten after the animal dies. So in this case, after the animal dies, it's permitted to eat. It's not like we're going to say, okay, the hind part of the animal was separated while the animal's still alive, therefore the hind part is forbidden. One might think that. What it's saying is that footnote, for such an action is considered to be an act of slaughtering, which removes the prohibition of Akai. So if the action is the slaughter, and earlier it was discussed if the head is removed, would the head be prohibited because the head was removed? Well, no, because removing the head is the act of slaughter. And even though the heart is still pumping for a minute or so, for a brief period of time after the head is removed, the head is still, that is considered the act of slaughter. Therefore, afterwards, after the heart stops pumping, it's permitted to consume meat off of the head. Here it would be permitted to eat the meat that the animal was slaughtered by cutting it in half. That might be as opposed to the other one from yesterday, one of the other ones where it says, if the thigh and the joining socket were removed. Well, in that case, that doesn't necessarily, even though it kills the animal. If the action is clearly going to kill the animal and the animal dies as a result, then it's the act of slaughter. If it doesn't necessarily kill the animal, then that extra meat would be considered a limb of a living animal. Okay, we have a figure 1. There's not that many figures in this book, so I'm not sure how to use this. The picture showing a sketch of a section of the windpipe. That's the trachea of a cow, and it's going to explain the way a cut is done for kosher slaughter. And there's certain halakha that is related to this. So I made a photocopy. Hopefully that can be seen. In this sketch, A is the windpipe with ring structure. Pipe has a certain look to it. A certain, when the cow or whatever is being slaughtered is opened up, there's a certain structure to it. B is the position of the half of the diameter of the windpipe, which is an important location for the halakha. C is the cap of the windpipe. D is the area allowed for kosher slaughter cut. This area extends to the left up from the beginning of the flank of the lung. So it's the area between, I don't think where the vocal cords are, I'm not sure, but the cap is where it's connected to the area that was the adjoining windpipe and esophagus. The esophagus goes towards the stomach. So towards the area towards the head where it separates, that's C. And from D is from where it separates towards heading towards the lungs. And E shows a kosher slaughter cut goes past the halfway point. And this figure is adopted from Shokot Chulin by Rabbi Amiti Ben David, Jerusalem 2001. So when they do a kosher slaughter cut, the trachea has to be cut a little bit past the halfway point. If it's completely cut, then it's not a proper kosher slaughter, from what I understand. But it has to be cut a little bit past, at least a little bit past the halfway point for kosher slaughters. And this is important for some of the halakkas in this area of the book. Chapter 4. Maimed or broken limbs. The following precepts apply to a limb or flesh that has been maimed at the place where it is attached to the animal's body, which has not been detached entirely. It is still attached somewhat to the animal's body and is hanging loosely from it. The portion can no longer heal as might an ordinary portion of the body. There are some Torah authorities who consider it as flesh or a limb that is severed from a living animal. Shach and Pri Megillim, Siegfried, Da'at, 62:7. If the hanging portion can no longer heal the ordinary portion of the body, there are some Torah authorities who consider it as flesh I actually read that twice. That's also Tosefta, end of Tractate of Avodah Zarah, and Eshkol Hilkot Treifot, chapter 20. So these are the authorities that are considering a limb of a living animal, a detached limb of a living animal. If it's something that is not, a chunk of flesh or a limb is broken off, and the divine code is going to go into some detail explaining what exactly that means, how to define it in that. Some authorities say that it's forbidden, and some authorities would say that it's not forbidden. So this is a gray area that will get somewhat complicated, because the gray area is where it gets complicated. The basic opinion is that there's no prohibition in this case, as long as the limb never became totally detached during the animal's lifetime. Hence, a Gentile is permitted to eat flesh from this limb, eat from this flesh or limb after the animal's death. So the basic opinion is that's permitted. Opinion is not permitted. Therefore, the entire chapter is going to go into questions about this. And a nice footnote here. Rambam writes, Laws of Forbidden Foods 5:2, that a hanging limb that was hanging while the animal was still alive is considered Aver Memakai dies. And even if the animal is rendered kosher, receives kosher slaughter, the hanging limb is still forbidden by Torah law, according to his opinion. So the Rambam, who's a well-respected authority, would say that it's not permitted. It's forbidden to have this hanging limb, as will be defined later in this chapter, exactly how that figures. So because someone like the Rambam says it's forbidden, it needs to be paid. We still need to pay attention to it, even if we don't follow his halakha. We still have to, because he's considered a high authority. Islamic Tzedek, I'm sorry, Rashi and Tosafot, Chulin 47a, disagree with Rambam, saying that in such a case, it is forbidden for Jews, but only by decree of the sages. For Gentiles, there is no difference in rabbinical opinion as to whether such a prohibition. There is a difference in rabbinical opinion as to whether such a prohibition exists. So if it's decreed by the sages, then it's not Torah law, and therefore it doesn't directly apply. The question is whether or not the logic of the decree of the sages whether that logic would still apply to a Gentile. The Islamic Tzedek, Yeridea, chapter 63, and others hold that the Rambam's opinion is that there is no prohibition for Gentiles to eat a hanging limb after the animal's death. But other rabbis disagree, including the Pre-Megillim and Sifri Da'at 62.9, and consider the Rambam's opinion for Gentiles equal to the Torah law for Jews, saying that the death of the animal causes the hanging limb to be considered severed during its lifetime, and therefore it would be prohibited for Gentiles as Avraham Akai. So there are some that consider the hanging limb to be not the limb severed from an animal during its life. There's other people that would consider it to be a limb severed. If it's considered a limb severed from the animal during its life, then it would definitely be a Torah prohibition. Then it might be a rabbinic prohibition, or it may be permitted altogether. It's a bit, so there's a number of questions going on here. For the first opinion, the Islamic Tzedek, from the Shita, that's Baba Basra 20a, which quotes Rabbi Yosef Mishka, who points out that there is no prohibition for a Gentile in this situation. The lenient opinion should be followed for several reasons. Most early authorities clearly say that the prohibition for a Jew to eat a hanging limb from a kosher slaughtered animal is only a decree by the sages upon Jews. Clear prohibition stated for a Gentile. So if this was a decree of the sages, not a Torah violation, but a decree of the sages, without it being expressed for Gentiles, then the decree would not necessarily. But kosher slaughter makes an animal immediately permitted for a Jew does not apply for Gentiles, and yet we find that a Gentile may eat a hanging limb from a kosher slaughtered animal and flesh from it while the animal is still convulsing. Since kosher slaughter removes the condition of Avraham Makai. So apparently there is and it's not clearly referenced where, but there's apparently an example of a Gentile removing flesh from a hanging limb while the animal is convulsing after a Jewish slaughter. after a kosher slaughter. And the state here, but apparently there is a reference to this. If it's a reference to it, then it would show that it's permitted. This proves, so the fact that it says this proves shows that there is a location for this somewhere. That have considered severed during the animal's lifetime, since if it were, the flesh of the limb would be prohibited by Torah for a Gentile, because kosher slaughter can only leave room for rabbinic prohibition of Aver Mimachai, prohibition from the Torah. An important point too that would help to explain some of the ambiguousness of the earlier chapter slaughter. If it's a rabbinic prohibition on the Gentile, then the kosher slaughter can remove that rabbinic prohibition. But if it's a Torah prohibition, that's where you get down to bedrock of the halakha. Then it's having a kosher slaughter would not make a difference. So that helps us to understand that whether something is a rabbinic or a Torah violation. In this case, it would appear, because it could be the non-Jew can have meat removed from the hanging limb after kosher slaughter, would indicate that any prohibition against a hanging limb is rabbinic rather than Torah. And it's important to know which column the prohibitions are in. If this flesh were prohibited by the Torah, the sages would have decreed that it's forbidden to be eaten forever. On the other hand, the sages permitted the Gentile to eat flesh that is severed from a hanging limb of a convulsing kosher slaughtered animal after the animal's death, because the risk that this could lead to transgressing the animal's prohibition of Aver Mimachai, as explained in footnote 71 above, has been lessened. So the prohibition, the general prohibition. So there's apparently a prohibition against eating of this meat, but it's considered to be rabbinic because there's this allowance in the case of kosher slaughter. That would indicate such as a Gentile slaughter. If it goes through a Gentile slaughterhouse, by Torah law, it would still be permitted, but by rabbinic decree, it would be prohibited because it's very close to the limb of a living animal, the severed limb of a living animal. Because it's so close to it, there's a necessity to make a rabbinic decree to prevent people from transgressing in a real way. Therefore, they put a fence around it. But in a more holy environment, or more serious environment of a kosher slaughterhouse, which is much more serious than a non-kosher slaughterhouse, the concern, the need for a fence is not as strong in a kosher slaughterhouse as a non-kosher slaughterhouse. B. That's the second reason. A hanging limb could not be forbidden to a Gentile and permitted to a Jew, as this would contradict the general rule in Kulin 33a and Sanhedrin 59a that Torah law is always at least as strict for Jews as for Gentiles. So if something is, generally speaking, if something is permitted to a Jew, then it would also be permitted to a Gentile. That's the general rule of thumb. And because apparently, it doesn't go into much detail here, but apparently the hanging limb would be permitted in some manner to a Jew, and therefore the Gentile, it would also have to be permitted. C, the third reason. For Jews who have commandments regarding the animal after its death, regarding eating and spiritual impurity, there's a practical dimension to the rule that death can confer a status of a limb having been severed while the animal is still alive. However, since Gentiles do not have these commandments, prohibition from the Torah is the no-hide commandment against eating severed flesh while the animal is still alive. Surely in the present situation where the animal is already dead, there is no reason to forbid a hanging limb. We have seen elsewhere, earlier in the book, where the question of whether or not something is considered flesh from a living animal or not, the question of ritual impurity, Jewish ritual impurity, does play into it. Therefore, there would be some dimension to that. It's an indication, it's a hint that there's something is considered flesh from a living animal or not considered flesh from a living animal, as to whether the Jewish impurity laws. However, the Jewish impurity law in and of itself does not have an effect upon non-Jews. Therefore, it's a hint, but it's not a determination. I think that's what the third reasoning is saying here. So when all three are put together, each reason in and of itself may not be sufficient, but when all three areas are considered, the divine code has taken the position that the Torah law is that a non-Jew can eat the flesh of a living animal. However, as there is strong opinion otherwise, it becomes very complicated and needs to be there's going to be several pages, several days worth of pages that they're going to go into this. And that's where it gets interesting. Okay, thank you.